one of the questions we should be asking ourselves, particularly those of us who would like to see a strong progressive left in this country, is when did the Democrats become the party of so-called fiscal responsibility, and should they be the party of fiscal responsibility? Our next guest has written an excellent piece on that for Jacobin magazine entitled "The Democrats Are Eisenhower Republicans." Josh Mound is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Virginia. He has a PhD in history and sociology from the University of Michigan, and he joins us now. Josh, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with this. What do you mean when you say that the Democrats are Eisenhower Republicans?
Well, prior to the right turn among the GOP in economic policy during the Eisenhower era, Republicans were really known as the party of balanced budgets. They were incredibly afraid of deficits because they were afraid that deficits would stoke inflation. And really, after the Goldwater nomination and the eventual sort of Reagan revolution in the party, Republicans became very comfortable with deficits. And Democrats responded to that by moving to the right themselves and trying to become the party of fiscal responsibility. And Bill Clinton had this famous quote that he said privately after he took office when some of his economic advisors, including Robert Rubin, the banker, advised him to sort of scale back his already pretty modest spending plans that he had run on in 92 and instead focus on reducing the deficit that had been left from Reagan. So really over this period between the 1950s and the 1990s, you sort of have the two parties really reversing positions, with the Republicans going from being the party of balanced budgets to the Democrats taking up that mantle.
Yeah, and I guess I think that's exactly right. And one of the implications for a policy in that and for politics is that when Republicans give up the mantle of a balanced budget, that means they can cut taxes for the wealthy and corporations as much as they want without worrying about the fiscal implications of that. When Democrats take on the mantle of quote unquote fiscal responsibility, and we can talk about what that really means, but when they take on that mantle, that means they're embracing the idea that maybe we don't have the money to do the things that Democrats are best known for, like Medicare, Social Security, infrastructure, job creation, that maybe they have to let go of all of that in the name of quote unquote fiscal responsibility. Is that a fair interpretation?
I think that's exactly right. And I would really say that it's the Democrats sort of voluntarily playing by a different set of rules. Republicans have decided that, as Dick Cheney said, deficits don't matter. And for Democrats, since Clinton, they've decided that deficits very much do matter. And so it's, a self-imposed limitation that Republicans have also very cleverly used against Democrats by ignoring deficits when there's a Republican president, and then when there's a Democratic president, all of a sudden Republicans are upset about deficits again. And when Democrats have set themselves up as being the party of fiscal responsibility, they really don't have, a good position to kind of counteract or argue against Republicans' worries about the deficit once you have a Democratic president.
They're still doing it too. I've met leaders in Congress and others, and I've seen others just talk about fiscal responsibility. It's really and say proudly that they believe in pay-go. Pay as you go, meaning we won't propose any program unless there's guaranteed money to pay for it. But a lot of the economists I know and trust say that it's the wrong focus, certainly at the wrong time, that government deficits are exaggerated as a problem, that it's much more important to have a robust economy and address inequality and some of the other things. So I wonder, Josh Mound, to what extent this is the Democrats getting played by Republicans and maybe following a broken economic philosophy, and to what extent they've actually internalized a kind of economic conservatism, maybe because their donors want it or for whatever reason, and are winding up really being ideologically a very different party than people think of them as being.
I think it's actually a little bit of both. Republicans very much engineer deficits. Conservative activists have been open about this. Milton Friedman advised Barry Goldwater in 1964 to, abandon the traditional Eisenhower focus on balanced budgets and instead just propose tax cuts and say that growth would pay for them, which is actually an idea that, goes back even further to the Calvin Coolidge era and Andrew Mellon, the Treasury Secretary under several Republican presidents. And this whole idea that tax cuts pay for themselves, we can run deficits as long as it's tax cuts, and eventually it'll all balance out through the fantastic growth that the market will unleash, is now really Republican dogma that they use to wave away deficits, when I think in reality, most Republicans understand that they are going to generate deficits, but the idea is, as Friedman and others have stated, we'll just leave those deficits for Democrats, and that means they'll sort of have fiscal handcuffs when they come into office, and it'll be Democrats making hard choices about what to cut or whose taxes to raise, while Republicans can sort of funnel money towards, the upper half of the income distribution, and often just the upper, 5 or 1% through their tax cuts. And, Democrats end up paying the price. But I think the other half of that, as you mentioned, is that Democrats have very much internalize this idea that they should be the party of fiscal responsibility. So it's not just that Republicans are cleverly playing Democrats. It's that Democrats have decided, for a variety of reasons, I think donors are one of them. Democratic donors are much more fiscally conservative than the rank and file of the party. And really going back to McGovern's loss in the early 70s, a lot of conservative Democrats had blamed that on McGovern proposing big spending programs. And the inflation of the 1970s was used by conservatives and really by a lot of Democrats as a reason to be afraid of big government programs, even though, in reality, the inflation of the 1970s wasn't because of deficits. It was because of, supply shocks like the oil crisis. But that sort of all fed its way into politics. And now you have this commitment to the Democrats to try to, please donors, please the upper income, well-off whites that the sort of new Democrats of Clinton really wanted to court, and also Republicans sort of using that against Democrats by running deficits and making the Democrats' job even harder once they're in office.
And again, we're talking with Josh Mound, whose new article for Jacobin magazine is about Democrats as Eisenhower Republicans. And Josh, let's talk about that notion for a second. I remember a few years ago, there was, in fact, I should say even more broadly before I remember, first of all, Rachel Maddow, about 10 years ago or so, announcing with great pride that she, in fact, was an Eisenhower Republican. And I remember this was a stratagem during the George W. Bush years that some people on the Democratic liberal side of the spectrum used, because at that time, any idea that was even vaguely liberal was being demonized in the media and on Capitol Hill. So the idea was, no, wait a minute, Dwight D. Eisenhower stood for all of this stuff. The 1956 Republican platform said things about expanding Social Security and unions and all these wonderful things. So this was actually an affectation that Democrats had at one point, 10 or 15 years ago. But have we reached a point in history where it's a tactical mistake?
Oh, I think it's, in terms of spending and taxing, it's very much a tactical mistake. I mean, to be sure, there's rhetorical power to note how high taxes on the rich were in the Eisenhower era. It has rhetorical power to certainly cite Eisenhower's military-industrial complex address. But when it comes to balanced budgets, we're really living in a different world than he was in the 1950s. And we're also dealing with a Republican Party that's very much different. And I think Democrats' desire to sort of claim that mantle, really had a long buildup before we get to Clinton. Thanks to eBay, I have a Jerry Brown button from his one presidential campaign in the 1970s where he says he's proudly in the mold of the Eisenhower Republicans. So you have all of these sort of conservative, or what we might call kind of neoliberal Democrats developing over, a couple decades from the 70s into the 90s with the rise of the Democratic Leadership Council and Clinton, who really wanted to sort of contrast themselves with the increasingly, deficit-heavy Republican Party as the responsible sort of adults in the room. And when you talk about the George W. Bush administration, you sort of have Democrats and liberal pundits calling themselves the reality-based community. and this idea by and large that liberals and Democrats are the ones who sort of believe in technocratic expertise, and they believe in social science, and they believe economists. And that's all good. I believe in all that stuff too. That's why I went to grad school. But at a certain point, you have to realize that it can be used as a political tool, and there's always some element of ideology behind any supposedly neutral expertise. And Republicans are very clever at marshaling that and using sort of their own conservative experts, like conservative think tanks, when they're in power, and then pivoting back to citing more respected organizations like the Congressional Budget Office when Democrats are in power. So, nothing is neutral ideologically. Republicans, I think, understand that a lot better than Democrats and liberal pundits do right now.
And I guess I would add to that. I think of a friend of mine who told me once that after he'd finished his first year of a PhD program in economics, that his introductory course to macroeconomics was the most ideological experience he'd ever had in his life. That in fact, economics itself, as it's practiced in this country and in Western Europe and elsewhere, is very much dominated by an ideology. You quote Milton Friedman at length in your article, The Economist, that by embracing this so-called neutral technocratic approach, you're really embracing a very heavy anti-government, pro quote-unquote free market, although I would argue that's a myth, ideology. And so I remember very well, I'm old enough to remember Jerry Brown running for president, and everybody was swooning over his youth and his charisma and his dating Linda Ronstadt, which at the time was, quite a hip thing to do, I guess. And I like Linda Ronstadt, don't get me wrong. But nobody was paying. I said, wait a minute. Nobody was paying attention to the fact that he was really trashing government in many ways and government's role in society. Or Bill Clinton saying in the early '90s, the era of big government is over. I mean, it seems to me that this Eisenhower Republican phase, or extended phase of the Democratic Party, is ideologically in many ways very conservative and needs to be pushed back against. Am I being overly combative?
No, I don't think so. I think that's very much true. And when you look at someone like Brown in particular, some of the things he said in the 1970s while he was governor of California and after, really sounded like things Ronald Reagan said when he was governor of California. But prior to that, or when he was running for president, he said things against welfare queens and people who were unemployed being lazy and all of that kind of stuff. So I think a lot of the neoliberal turn in the Democratic Party was about embracing some of the fundamental assumptions about how the economy worked, about what poverty meant, about what race meant. And we've kind of taken for granted today that that's sort of the Democratic legacy, because Clinton sort of took over the party, much as Reagan had taken over the Republican Party in the early 1980s. Clinton took over the Democratic Party in the early 90s, and we're still living with that legacy and that desire for Democrats to be the party of fiscal responsibility. And I think it is rooted in a lot of very conservative assumptions about economics. And there are good sort of progressive economists working at places like the Roosevelt Institute and other outfits today that I think are pushing really hard to try to get Democratic politicians to rethink some of our assumptions about the deficit and about spending and about what can reasonably be accomplished, and really about what it means to be sort of an evidence-based progressive. Because as you said, a lot of times the supposed evidence really has a conservative ideological bent. I mean, I may well have ended up an economist had I not taken microeconomics in undergrad with a guy who was advised by Milton Friedman and said that unions existed only because of the mafia and things like that during my undergrad class. So that discipline, I suspect, has changed a little bit, or hopefully is changing because of the Great Recession. And I think Democrats really need to kind of update their assumptions based on how history is unfolded and how the Republican Party has completely changed their ideology and tried to put Democrats on the defensive by purposely saddling them with deficits whenever possible.
Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there, but that's a good place to leave it. I think they are going to have to change their ideology, maybe something a little bit more like the ideology they held under FDR. And I'm afraid that if they don't do it, it could be that somebody else will. But Josh Mound, great article in Jacobin on Democrats as Eisenhower Republicans. Thanks for writing it, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.